Okay, it is just after 5:30. I will go ahead and get started with an introduction for us all tonight. Mahalo everyone for joining today's webinar. My name is Jill Wirt and I'll be your MC for tonight. I am a project manager with Maui Nui Marine Resource Council. Tonight we are joined by Dr. Clay Trauernicht, Extension Specialist in Ecosystems and Fire in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Management at UH Mānoa. Tonight, Clay will present on fire science to look at the how and why we are experiencing increases in the area burned each year by wildfires. To hear more about talks like these, you can sign up for our free monthly e-newsletter, Reef and Brief at mauireefs.org. Before we begin, I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge and offer our condolences from Maui Nui Marine Resource Council to the residents of Lahaina. Maui Nui Marine Resource Council stands with you, Lahaina, in the efforts to recover and protect our precious ecosystems and people to ensure they are protected from further damage. Mahalo to everyone for taking the time to be here tonight, as I know our community continues to work tirelessly to support those in need. For those who are new here, Maui Nui Marine Resource Council is a 501c3 nonprofit celebrating 15 years of working for clean ocean water, healthy coral reefs, and abundant native fish. Our work began with community members coming together to address concerns for coastal and marine resource management. Our work wouldn't be possible without the support of viewers and donors like you. Tonight's presentation is part of Maui Nui Marine Resource Council's monthly Know Your Ocean speaker series, usually held on the first Wednesday of each month at 5:30 p.m. via Zoom. This monthly series is supported by the County of Maui, and our next series will be held on Wednesday, October 4th at 5:30 p.m. via Zoom. Before we get started with our presentation tonight, I wanted to share a few announcements from Maui Nui Marine Resource Council. Our Hui Okawai'ola water quality monitoring program lost our lab in the Lahaina fire. Mahalo to all who have donated so far to help us recover our equipment and supplies to be able to continue to respond and monitor the environment. At this time, we're hoping to find a container or trailer office to be the new home of the lab. If you have access to or availability of a container for our use, please contact us at info@mauireefs.org. We also need a location for it on the west side that would eventually have water and electric hookups. MNMRC has been working diligently with partner agencies and organizations since the wildfire to ensure our precious ecosystems are protected from further damage. This is challenging for all involved as we navigate unknowns and human safety. So what we've been doing is water quality monitoring. Hui Okawai'ola volunteers collected coastal water samples from all accessible West Maui sites. This data is critical to understand the current conditions for future comparison. We are ramping up testing frequency and adding new sites on the west side. We've also collected continuous data profiles of water conditions in front of Lahaina and North Kihei, capturing info on turbidity, salinity, acidity, and oxygen content. This will help us understand changes over time in response to fire and stormwater runoff. We'll soon be performing in-water 3D mapping of Lahaina and Kihei's reefs to capture imagery of current reef health to aid in recovery efforts and identify changes. We'll also perform infrared submarine groundwater discharge mapping to help understand movement of potentially contaminated groundwater inputs. MNMRC is prepared with baseline data and is ready to deploy staff to capture runoff from the quote unquote first flush or initial discharge from burned watersheds when rains arrive. In coordination with partners, we'll collect water and sediment samples. Many of these initial response efforts are unfunded. We appreciate any support you can provide to conduct monitoring, which will inform best management practices for recovery for both people and the environment. To donate, visit mauireefs.org/donate. A few notes before we introduce our speaker. We will leave time at the end of the presentation to answer your questions, and we invite you to submit your questions by using the Q&A button on the lower edge of your Zoom screen. I'll be moderating the Q&A this evening and make sure those questions are being read aloud. This presentation is being recorded and streamed to Facebook Live and will be available on our YouTube and Facebook profiles. If you're viewing live from Facebook, you can submit your questions as a comment and they will be relayed to me. And now for our speaker. Dr. Clay Trauernicht grew up on Long Island and is grateful to his family for lots of time spent camping, fishing, and surfing. He came to Hawaii in 1999 as a wildlife project intern, but soon turned to plant science, pursuing graduate degrees at UH and University of Tasmania, leading to work with community-based land care programs in many parts of the world. He's been an extension specialist faculty at UH Mānoa since 2013, working primarily on fire science and management across Hawaii and Micronesia. In 2021, he started a new position at UH, which has expanded his extension program to support workers doing watershed conservation and restoration in Hawaii more broadly. Thank you so much for being here tonight, Clay. I'm very excited for your presentation, obviously very timely, and I will let you take it from here.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'll pop up my PowerPoint slide, but I just, want to say that I think I didn't really know what I was getting into when I said yes. It was like I talk about fire all the time, and the context of this is obviously something I've never experienced before, much like all of us in the community, and so we're sort of figuring things out as we go. And just thanks for the opportunity, and hope maybe we can clarify some things that have happened, and maybe think about, really what I want to talk about today is like, how do we prevent this thing from the future and from happening in the future, and to just really drive the point home that, as sad as this is, it was preventable. So here, I'll pop up my PowerPoint slides. And then can you just tell me if you are seeing the slides or the presenter view?
I see presenter view right now.
Okay. How about now?
Looks good.
All right. So I've talked a lot about fire over the years here in Hawaii. And to me, it always comes back kind of like our relationship with fire. And that's this fundamental thing we all share as humans. I mean, it's such like throughout our evolutionary history, it's been this fundamental tool for managing lands, obviously for gathering and preparing food, all of these things. It's like at the core of us as a species, really. And then this thing happens, this disaster happens. And it's just such a sign of how broken our relationship is with fire here in Hawaii. And it really is more a symptom of how broken our relationship is with land. And so when I'm framing this as land care, this is going from everything from like your garden to the mountain to the reef, the work that Maui Nui Marine Resource Council does. This is really like, how do we care for the environment around us, which really is caring for us and our community. So the fire is like this lens to understand kind of what's going wrong. And it's really confronts us with some pretty stark challenges that we need to deal with in order to move forward and prevent something like this from happening again. I wanted to point to this fact. Maybe some of you read these articles. So over the years, I've been writing about fire, both in the scientific literature, which I don't expect really anybody to read, but also in the popular literature too, trying to get this message out. And I'm raising these things not because, really the only interest here is that I really care about this. And, I can't really identify with the depth of feelings that folks in Lahaina with family and friends in Lahaina are feeling. I really do connect to the grief and the anger that people feel. The fact that all of this messaging that I've been kind of the ways in which I've been trying to tell the story over the years, it's the same, right? I could be saying the same thing that's in these articles right now. It's nothing has changed except for this impact and this disaster. And so I'm going to talk about that, like how these fires are happening. And then I'm going to talk about why, like what really is the root cause of these fires. And I think it's a challenging thing to confront, because it really plays out where the struggle is to make changes as a society. And I also want to point out that I'm not the first person to bring these concerns up. I work with lots of people, especially folks at Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, who just do tremendous work. And we are all standing on the shoulders of folks like these guys, Miles Nakahara and Wayne Ching, who passed away in 2020, maybe thankfully before they got to see something like this. And they were at the Division of Forestry and Wildlife, and they really paved the path for those of us that work in this and kind of working with communities, working with land managers to try to reduce the impacts of fire, coordinating across all of the fire agencies in the state, getting the counties and state cooperating. Wayne was really instrumental in getting all these cadets in the county programs trained in wildland fire. And Miles was a founding member of the Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization. And so again, we really, we learned so much from folks like this, and then folks that are still responding to these fires and are telling us that they need more help. And this is really like the fundamentals of fire management, is all of these things that we could be doing to give the firefighters a chance and to relieve some of the burden that's falling on their shoulders. And we know fire is changing. I'm going to come back to this, but just so to give you some kind of historical context here, this shows the land area burned across the state by year, going back to 1904 up through 2022, up to last year. And we actually have these records because there was a really big fire on the Hamakua coast, the Big Island, so on the windward side, wet side of Big Island, that happened in 1901. And it sort of freaked people out. It's like, what the hell is going on? 30,000 acres burned for months. And it made some changes at the time. It was really the impetus to form the Division of Forestry and Wildlife. They formed the first forest reserve at that time. And ironically, well, maybe this will become ironic as I get further into the talk, this was really in the interest, even then, of preserving water. They knew that they needed to maintain forest cover in our watersheds to produce water, but the people in interest there being the plantations, right? And so this is really where they were focusing their attention. I'll get to that. Like this, we got to unpack this history, because this is, those of you know your Hawaiian history will probably start to put some of the pieces together with just this information alone. But what we're seeing is we've gone from about 5,000 acres burning per year through most of the last century. And then in the 1990s, we kind of flipped this switch. That's 1969, big spike there. That was one huge fire by Pu'anahulu. So, but for the most part, 5,000 acres a year. And then all of a sudden we are in the 90s and forward, and we're looking at about 20,000 acres per year. And of course it's up and down. Our wet years, we get less fire, but I'm going to come back to this. This is what we're trying to understand, right? So what changes are happening in the landscape? I'm going to start with the how, and then I'll talk a little bit about the why. Just thinking about like the deeper history in Hawaii, it's important to understand, and I always forget to even mention this, because fire in Hawaii is so centered around human changes and what we're doing. It's important to remember that fire played very little role in the evolutionary history of Hawaii. So a lot of our native ecosystems were really not exposed to a lot of fire, apart from active lava flows. Lightning strikes are pretty rare. And they don't do well in the current context. And it's not that they can't recover, plants can't grow back after they fire from seed, after they burned, but it's really the combination of all these weeds that have now moved into, after European contact. So, thousands of weed species. I think right now we're at about, there's a slightly more naturalized weeds than there are native plants in Hawaii, to put things in context. And I'll talk a little bit about these species, the sort of troublemakers as well. But now we're looking at a very different situation, right? And typically in the past, I'm talking about these fires in respect to the impacts they have on our forests, on our watersheds, and on the reefs as well, right? So these are really primarily the areas of concern, because this is really where the impacts are happening. And that's really a testament to our firefighters. They're typically able to get between these fires and our communities, and they do a pretty fantastic job. But when they hammer our forests, these places don't come back. This is probably the biggest stand of Willy Willy trees on Oahu that burned up in 2018. A fire jumped over the mountain from Makaha in the Kea'au Valley here and burned up this this is just like irreplaceable heritage, right? And then the reef, the impacts on the reef, it's just like not looking at the wave here, but like the big flood of sediment in the back, right? And so fire is really directly related to coastal health, marine health, because once you remove all that vegetation, that land is prone to eroding off, is prone to soil loss. And more, and I think really with the help of working with firefighters, and working with Hawaii Wildfire Management Organization, again, is we're turning our attention to this, what we call in the fire world, the wildland urban interface, which is this kind of horrible jargon for the land around our communities. Like, where are our communities exposed to fires? This is that same fire on Oahu in 2018, 3 valleys burning at once. And it's jarring to see these things, to see to see this happening, really. And so as our communities are exposed to this, one of the outcomes of this is that we get more support and we get action being taken. But it's also, we've, again, been very good at protecting these communities. But these impacts are real and they're recurrent. And it's really important, especially given all of the tragedy that we're experiencing and talking about in Lahaina, that this risk is persistent across the state, right? And we've done all this homework, Hawaii Wildfire has, at least for this one, and assessing what the risk is, what are the hazards around our communities. And again, it's high across the board. And so again, we've known about this and we're just trying to look towards what these changes have occurred around our communities, because this is what we're dealing with. We're dealing with landscapes that have changed kind of where we stand, that are now threatening us with these kinds of incidents. So the how is this happening? We know these fire regimes are changing. You saw that timeline, and it's a pretty simple recipe. This is kind of like the maybe broader brush for fire science, of this idea of fire regimes. And it's like how these 3 elements really coalesce to create patterns that we observe in landscape burning. And so for climate, we know that our leeward sides are persistently dry. But what we really hammers us are these wet, dry cycles. So we get good rains in the wintertime. It's enough for all that grass to grow, and you're accumulating fuels in the landscape. And then it dries out come summer, or we hit a drought and it dries out. So it's really these up and down wet cycles, in addition to the rain shadow effects. And we're also seeing some troubling long-term drying trends, right? So this is pretty particular to different parts of Hawaii. But yeah, it seems that we are getting an overall reduction in rainfall. And then ignitions. You need something to start the fire. And I think the main, the idea to take home here is that ignitions are almost constant. So these are ignitions by week. We just put this data set together. This goes from 2005 to 2020. And the vast majority of these ignitions are small. Again, small fires, because our firefighters are very good at their job. Like, they can get in and they can contain these things rapidly. It's about 5% of those fires that turn into these, 100 acres or bigger. So it's a very small percentage of these incidents that happen that actually have the impacts that we're worried about. So ignitions are almost human caused, and it's just important to see that they're almost constant. And those big flashes of red that you're seeing are like July and New Year's. So you can see how human behavior is a big component to this. About 75% of these fires are accidental. And on the vegetation side, the problem is really unmanaged non-native grasslands. And it's really important to make this distinction between unmanaged and managed. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but it's really these areas in which we're not really actively using, or not actively, taking actions to limit these fuels, to do anything with these lands. I mean, these are all these fallow agricultural fields, places like this. And what happens there, as you guys well know in Maui, is they fill in with these grasses, they fill in with these fire-prone shrubs from all over the world. And just to take a little closer look at this, these ecosystems are pretty much they're savannas, like anywhere else in the tropics, you call them savannas. They burn at very high intensity. So they accumulate biomass, really unparalleled to anywhere else I can find in the world, the quantity of grass that's out there. They burn very fast, right? So they're really sensitive to wind and change in wind direction. So they can burn erratically, change direction really quickly, and create incredibly difficult conditions for fire suppression. I mean, and with respect to this Lahaina fire, for example, the time between that fire starting and it reaching the homes, you're talking on the order of minutes, just because how quickly these fires are able to spread through these fuels. The other thing to kind of understand about these is that it is a mix of different vegetation types. And so what we see as these grasslands left kind of uncared for is they start filling in with shrubs, and the shrubs, that woody component, it increases the likelihood of these embers, right? So we get these ember showers when these fires burn through that. And that's incredibly important, because what that does is it allows fires to jump fire breaks. It allows spot fires to start way out ahead of the fire. And this is something else that we're contending with, especially in these high wind events. When I first started working on fire, I was coming out of botany degree, right? And so like in botany, you kind of think about these little, you're at the plant level, right? The scale of plants, and fire really forces you to think big and really start thinking for the first time, like, what is the scale of these grasslands across the state? And when we look at Hawaiian ecosystems, here are in purple. So that's anything from forest to shrubland to grassland. There's a little bit of native grassland left. We're talking about 1.3 million acres of a total of 4 million acres across the state. And then these non-native ecosystems, which are all the other things here, shrubland, grassland, forest, these are non-native ecosystems. They cover about 1.5 million acres. And when we combine where we have these non-native grasses being the dominant vegetation, so even in these shrublands where the dominant ground cover, right, in these shrublands is these non-native grasslands, we're looking at about 1 million acres statewide. So just the scale of this problem is giant, it's enormous. And I think that's also something to really keep in mind and to really understand, because we can't be naive about the work that it's going to take to manage these fuels, right? To kind of flip this from unmanaged grasslands to managed grasslands, or potentially to other forms of land use, which I'll talk about in a little bit as well. And when we look at the fires, these are all the outlines of fires for the past 20 years or so. They're predominantly happening in these grasslands and shrublands, right? So this is the crux of it. This is where fires are having the biggest impact. Even for these spaces where it's burning into native forest, typically it starts in those ecosystems and burns up into forested areas. And so this kind of perpetuates this grass cycle. It's kind of starting in these grasslands, and then when it burns into the forest and successive fire after successive fire, you get this switch from forest cover to grass cover. So the grasses move in, the trees die, and then you're just primed for the next fire the following year. And again, you have seen this on Maui. We've seen the forest line retreating up above Ma'alaia. We've seen it retreating up above Lahaina. The difference here being now we're talking about impacts on people, right? And that's the big, this is the new space that we're in and trying to grapple with right now. Why it's important to understand these things, really, at the end of the day, you know, fire is just a fire. You know, it doesn't really mean anything until you think about, you know, what is it impacting? So if it's forest or the community, and that's when we want to take action. If we want to reduce these impacts. And this is really critical because these drivers allow you to understand how we intervene. What are the actions that we can take to address these? And, you know, when you think about a fire, it's kind of part of this larger cycle where, you know, once that fire happens and you're in the suppression, this is like 100% reactionary. This is kind of the space that we've been operating in for the most part, where we are relying on our firefighters to come in. We're relying on them to respond and to get between this brush and our homes. And then in the aftermath, right? What are we doing for post-fire response? Trying to reduce erosion, trying to promote native species. We're backpedaling in this space, right? This is not where we want to be operating. What we want to be is in the green and being proactive. And so prevention, that's about education. That's like an effort to reduce ignitions. And then mitigation, which is really about dealing with the fuels, but also the built environment. Like, how do we make our homes more prepared, our communities more prepared, evacuation, things like this, right? And so again, I'm coming at this from the plants. And so a lot of the work that I do is more in this mitigation. What are like the best practices for that? But I also work closely with Hawai'i wildfire on the prevention side, home hardening, things like that. So there are like really explicit actions that we can take to reduce this risk. And I'll come back to that. I want to show examples and kind of share where things are actually happening, because I think that's the other message that's important to keep in mind, that if we dwell too much on climate, for example, and I can speak from experience here, because I would say half of the reporters that called me up about this Lahaina fire and these Maui fires were on me, like, it's climate change, it's climate change. Is it climate change? No, it's got to be climate change. And whereas climate change is going to make this harder to deal with, and I've heard it from firefighters themselves. They're telling me, especially in the aftermath of the Waiko Road fire, this is the big one through central Maui in 2019, and the Mānoa Road fire in 2021 that burned about 40,000 acres on Big Island. And they're telling us they've never seen fire behavior like this in 20, 25-year careers, right? And so we're getting into this space where I'm confident in their knowledge and their experience. But the flip side of that is it's about the vegetation that makes us so sensitive to this, right? And so the silver lining, if there's any of this, is that vegetation is something we can deal with. We can change it, we can alter it, we can make it less likely to burn. And so that's really where we kind of start pointing to towards solutions. This part, though, I want to kind of get into like the why. Is my transition. So that's the how piece. I want to like think about these Lahaina fire, and I think it's really important, and Kula as well, just to understand, like, when we look at these landscapes, and this is just a map of vegetative cover. This is this new kind of tool that we're developing, which allows us to map fuels, like the kinds of vegetation, a very coarse scale, just kind of woody versus grassy, but in real time. Excuse me. So we can actually, this is a map of up through 2023, right before the fires, right? So we're able to kind of produce this to kind of understand, well, to understand what fuel types are we looking at. And obviously the thing that jumps out at us right away is just the vast extent of grassland that's surrounding these communities. And sort of also, right, surrounding our watershed forests. So there, we're all, on all islands is the similar pattern where our communities and our watershed forests, all these values that we have, like the things that we care about, are sort of surrounded by these very grassy vegetation. But why? What is going on? Why it looks like that? And the other thing that we have to contend with now is land use and the history of land use in Hawaii. And this is going to lead me back to that long-term fire history that I was showing. And when we look at prior land use around Lahaina and around Kula, what we're seeing here, and again, all of you guys that live on Maui and know this history, this is not going to be news to you, is we're talking about former plantation lands. Sugar around Lahaina, and then a little bit mix of sugar below in the lower part of the Kula fire, and then up into active grazed pasture on the Mauka side. And, you know, and I just want to also point out on this Kula fire that this being active managed lands meant that there were people, right? There were humans, there are friends that work and community members that work at Haleakala Ranch and other ranches responding to this fire. And so there's a huge difference again, and I'll get into this a little bit, between when I say managed versus unmanaged lands. And that is one of the differences, the human element of this. So this is what we're dealing with. This is this land use change. This is the kind of driver, right, of why the vegetation is the way that it is, and what's creating risk around our communities. We got a preview of this, right? The Lahaina fire, these fires during Hurricane Lane on West Maui. I mean, this was a bad one. We lost, I think there's 21 homes were destroyed in this. Fortunately, no lives were lost. They were evacuating hurricane shelters during this. And, you know, so we have seen this happen combined with hurricane, right? Like, you have these multiple hazards happening, and pushing our emergency responders again to the limit of their capacity to deal with this. And then we saw it again. That's the next year, right? Like we know what was going to happen when sugar pulled out of central Maui. You had 36,000 acres go out of production. And then it took 3 years, but sure enough, we get these fires, about 17,000 acres, burn across central Maui. I think if you combine these Mānoa fires and these fires on the west side, it was about 25,000 acres burn on Maui, just in Maui. So you're getting up into like, you know, the averages for the whole state on your island alone. So again, this is like, we're seeing this happen. We can point to these changes, and that's really where I'm kind of coming into the next slide of the why is Hawaii burning. And so this is the same data up at the top. We're looking at the total area burned per year from 1904, and then this big jump, and then starting in about the 90s. And when we try to correlate this with other things that are happening, the best relationship, the like most direct relationship we can fit this to is really these huge declines in agricultural production that coincide with this jump in fire risk, or fire extent rather. And so this bottom is land under production in the thousands of acres. This is data from this book, Statistics of Hawaii, that was published in 1977 by the state statistician, Robert Schmidt, I believe his name is. It's coming from, more recent data is from the USDA, National Agricultural Statistical Survey, I think, or Statistical Service. And then we have some really cool products, a 1980 spatial map of agricultural land use, and then an update in, I think, 2015 and 2020 that Ryan Perroy at UH Hilo has done. So we actually can look at the footprint of these these changes, which is where that data came, that I was showing at those maps of Lahaina and Kula. And so this really forces us to think about not only what's happening in this timeline, but again, what's happening prior to it, right? Because if we can't understand what's happening prior to this timeline, we have very little chance, in my opinion, of dealing with this into the future, right? The other side of the timeline. And so what we're seeing here really just connects us back to this process of colonization. I mean, this fire in Lahaina is a direct consequence of this imposition of an economic system that shifted focus away from human well-being. This is the gentlest words I can use, and shifted towards wealth as a function of commodity agricultural production, right? So instead of a system that values human well-being, health of the land, which is equal to health of the community, right? We get this huge shift into commodity extraction from the land. And this is very uncreative. This is the same pattern we've seen across the world through the colonial history, a little bit maybe earlier than this in some parts of the world, a little bit later in others, but it's the same story that we're seeing in Hawaii as we've seen the world over. American businessmen in this case, they come in, they see the opportunity to extract wealth, and that is through sugarcane production, it's through grazing, and it's through pineapple as well, right? So we look at this as, how do we make money off this? You get land privatization. Again, I'm apologize because I don't have time to get into the whole history of Hawaii, but the gist is you get land privatization, the overthrow of the monarchy, and who has control over the lands and what are they doing with the lands? And so when the timeline here is starting, you're talking about deforestation, leveling these lands, you're diverting water to use and to irrigate these crops. And you rely not only on exploitation of the land and the water, you rely on exploiting labor to do this as well. And that kind of leads us into the declines that we see in the middle here. So this is the first part of the story, is the exploitation of land for commodity crop production. And then we see this decline and the shift, and I think this also leads into a history that's well understood. Like I don't have to write this. So there's books about this. So I can cite that chart this out. But what's happening is, because the exploitation of the labor force was so harsh and wages were so low, you get this really militant labor movement happening in the 30s and 40s. At the same time, you get this post-war economic boom, which really was pushed by the labor movement across the nation, to the benefit of the vets and all these things coming back. So you have this rising middle class. The cost of agricultural production is declining, right? And right at the same time, you're gonna, on the heels of this, you get this huge boom in the tourism industry, right? The tourist industry is just starting to crank up. And so what do you do to make money in this context? You no longer have the profit margins you have from agricultural production. So you shift gears to real estate development. And this is really leading us into the problem that we're talking about now. Like, why is housing so affordable? Why is land so unaffordable? Sorry. Why is land so expensive? Why do we have farmers struggling to try to have access to these resources? And it's all embedded in this. And really what we see with fire is it's a symptom of these larger societal problems, right? This sort of failure of our current economic system to care for land and at the same time care for people, care for communities. You know, there's so much more complexity to this and so many more dynamics and like the story of where and this kind of struggle within this, but that's really like this top level kind of shallow sketch of what's leading to fire. So again, I can talk about all the ecological things and even like the human dimensions of this in the context of how fire is happening, but why it's happening, you have to wade into this political realm. And all of the Hawaiians that are speaking about this, especially in the context of Lahaina, they're pointing right to the source of this. They are pointing at this process and they're not wrong. This is really where we are and what we have to grapple with. Like if we want to fix this, if we want to address where that upper line is going, we need to think about how do we build a society that places human welfare above these other profits, above this scramble for profit in the real estate realm. How do we get access to land? How do we make water available to do these projects that we'd like to see? And the shift in this, when you get these declines in ranching, you get these declines in agriculture, is what we're seeing on the land in these fires that are burning incredibly intensively. They are stretching the limits, again, of our firefighters to deal with. Not only are the fuels more dangerous, but they no longer have access to resources that were being maintained on these agricultural lands. There's no water for them. There's no machinery. There's no knowledge that the people had about where to go. Where's the next safe space for you guys to do? What can I get my fire truck over that gate? Like, so we've lost all of the support that they've had historically. And again, this is not, I'm not making this up. This is from long interviews I've had with firefighters telling me what conditions used to be, you know, not that long ago. So I apologize, I'm getting fired up, but this is really the difficult things that we need to contend with, because what we need is to really reorient our society to rethink how we use the land around us and how we care for it. And the fire is just a symptom of this. Like the devastation that we've seen in Lahaina is just a symptom of our, as a society, like to fail to do this. And really, who has the power to dictate what happens with water and what happens with land? And this, again, it centers the solutions right into where the community in Lahaina has been speaking out. All from what I've seen, they are pointing to what needs to happen, and the fire is directly connected to that, to those concerns. I think the second most common question that's asked to me is, what could have been done differently? And I just start to lose my mind a little bit, because I flash back to me sitting in the middle of Makaha Valley in 2018, when fires are burning on both sides of the mountain and two valleys on either side of me. The entire valley is on fire. Helicopters are running around trying to do bucket drops to save these homes, and people are playing golf. The only thing that's not burning is the golf course in the middle of the valley. So to come at this and say, oh, well, you know, what do we do? What could we do? There's so much we could be doing differently. We have the technology, we have the knowledge, and I'm not saying we need golf courses across, you know, no offense to people who like golf. I don't see golf courses as a solution. I just want to point out this contradiction, right? This is just glaring us in the face of like, oh, right, like we can manipulate water, we can manipulate plants. And I'll get into maybe some other examples of what that happens, but the same thing is you go down just north up the road from Lahaina, and what are we doing with the water, right? I'm not trying to be, like subversive here. This is just like in our faces. What's going on? Where are we and how are we using these resources? And maybe you can tell, like, this is angering. This is not benefiting Hawaii as a whole. It is not benefiting people, diverting resources in this way. So what should it look like? I mean, this is the question we need to be asking ourselves, because Lahaina has so much to rebuild. There's so much that needs to happen there. This is so far out of my wheelhouse. The impact on the community and the families there and how they pick up lives and what do we do with the kids going to school? Like there's so much happening that needs to happen before maybe we think about plants. But I really think that plants are going to be part of this process to heal. I think that this is going to be, I hope that it's going to be central to trying to, pick up the pieces from this thing. But there's a lot of these other communities that are still at risk. Majorly at risk. We did a community meeting, Hawaii Wildfire Management organized it. It was just last week in Waianae. And usually we do these Firewise meetings for the community. We'll get like 10 to 15 people. 100 people showed up in person, 100 people on the Zoom call, right? So people are worried, they're scared. And I think they have every right to be, because this is a threat. This is persistent. And so we also need to be thinking about how do we help our neighbors around us. And so what should it look like? What could it look like? And there's so many different options. There's so many different answers to this question. Again, we're in this realm of fire management. We want to be in the green. We want to make our homes less likely to burn. There's all these actions that you could take tomorrow, like through Firewise programs. So like clean up around your yard. It's not rocket science. It's really intuitive. What kind of actions make your home less likely to burn? And then into the wider landscape. How do we care for the larger landscape, especially in these lowland areas? Maybe they're not picked up on the radar for like critical watersheds, but they are directly connected to our communities. One example here, thinking about these grass-dominated vegetation, is when we look at ranching across the state. This is a huge tool that we have. We have very knowledgeable people. We have animals on the land that can be used to reduce fire risk around communities. 750,000 acres currently on the maps, at least, are under active grazing. And so this has probably been, I would say, one of the more fruitful areas for partnerships with private industry in a way. And so like getting them, they've been very cooperative by and large in terms of using targeted grazing and strategic rotations. The other thing that we have in our ranching community is the knowledge to manage huge land areas. And this is a thing coming from conservation realm that we get a little bit naive and we want to bite off more than we can chew. When we think about restoring areas back into native ecosystems, back into forests, or even into agroforestry and farmland, that's going to take a lot of work and it's going to take time. And so we need to really lean on and value this community, I think, is going to be real central to any solution here. The watershed partnerships, this is a huge one. This is kind of closest to my heart because I work with these folks all across the state, and they are examples of these cooperative efforts to care for our watershed forests, right? They bring in private landowners, state agencies. The thing we have to realize with these guys, though, is that they're all basically operating on nonprofit, much like Maui Nui Marine Resource Council. We are depending on these guys to protect our resources, Malka and Makai, and they're on these shoestring budgets. The employees are working more than one job to make it by. Like this is, we need to understand that these guys are under-resourced. They have so much knowledge, so much care and love for what they do, but they are seriously under-resourced to do this work. And we have like lots of best practices. So Hawaii Wildfire has done so much on the planning side and community action. Like, what can you do around your neighborhoods? What needs to be done and what has been identified as priorities by the community. So we've done this hazardous mapping effort, the Community Wildfire Protection Plan. There's lots of resources out there. On the Pacific Fire Exchange is this program that I help run with Hawaii Wildfire. That's more looking at like large landowners, large land holdings. What do we do for planning across large lands? What are best practices to do fuel breaks and other fuels mitigation practices? So there's a lot of information to build from. And then we also have examples on the ground of what this can look like. So as I said, or maybe I didn't say this yet, but I've actually kind of taken on this other position, kind of doing more ecosystem conservation, ecosystem management side of things. And fires sort of shrunk until really recently. I mean, as far as I'm trying to put less attention to it. And one of the things that I've been really trying to be supportive of is the folks in Waianae, where we got this little hui of farmers and the Watershed Partnership is part of it. Hawaii Wildfire has been organizing these calls for, I think we're coming on 3 years, where we get together every month. We kind of keep tabs on grant opportunities and what people are doing. And it's really was these 2018 fires that motivated this group to start doing different stuff on the landscape. So this is my friend Bula, who lost everything in that 2018 farm. He wants to do aquaculture, but now he's managing sheep as well. And again, just to reduce the risk to his farm and the community below. DOFA has been really pioneering strategies in alternative, like vegetation conversion. So doing green breaks with native plants, trialing hydromulches to convert the grasses to other vegetation types. And this is an example right here. They've got this strip of native plants along one side of the road, which allowed the fire team, the DOFA, to come in on this road and defend the upper side of the valley from the fire approaching from below. So this is functional already. And this is I think maybe 2018. This picture is years old. So those trees are even bigger. They're shading out more grass than they were then. And Kaala Farm is a key partner here too. And just this idea of what could these landscapes look like? What is the alternative? And pretty much when it comes down to it, like anything where we're caring for land, from low-E restoration to dry land farming, like we have many options on the table, which would make these landscapes less flammable. And, just kind of bringing it back to Maui, there was this, this quote that I pulled out one of these op-eds with Civil Beat that really hit this thing home by Naka Nathaniel. We need to plant, plant, plant before we build, build, build. And again, as I was saying, like there's so much that needs to happen. There's so much help that Lahaina needs, and just what the community's been doing to organize over there is like astonishing. But that healing the landscape is going to be part of that. And when they're ready and when this, turning this forward so that we can prevent these kinds of disasters in the future, this really has to focus on improving our ability to care for the land and how and what we invest in as a society. And honestly, just to bring it back to this little letter that I wrote that connected me with so many people in Maui, it was amazing, just because I saw this article that was written by Kalinuechi. It was a beautiful article about these 2018 fires in Hurricane Lane, and the people that she was quoting were like, what are we going to do? What can we do? And I really wrote this to point out these efforts that are already happening. And so I read this after this fire. It's all the same stuff. Unfortunately, the attention now being paid, it had to come to this. Yeah, I wouldn't really change much of what there is to say. It's the same story. And so with that, I'm just going to close. And if you guys have questions, I probably went over time, but thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Clay. There is so much information in there. And I mean, this is a much longer conversation than just a 45-minute presentation. So just thank you for sharing your passion and your knowledge and your expertise in working in this area. We have quite a few questions coming into the Q&A already. So I'm going to start filtering through those, but I wanted to remind everyone that's viewing, if you have questions, on the lower edge of your Zoom screen, there's a little Q&A box, and you can type questions in and I relay them to Clay and we have an open discussion about them. So I will go ahead and start and just try and get through as many as I can. We'll stay a little bit later today because I'm sure there will be a lot of discussion around this. So we have a few questions just in regards to, not having access to water and not having the non-native grasses removed. So maybe if you could speak on that, of maybe why some of those grasses haven't been removed, or if it was just due to the land kind of being left unmanaged.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of simple answer, is that there was no action taken to reduce the grasses. And I think one of the problems that we're kind of confronting as a society is we have very little power to compel private landowners, right, to do anything, really. There are brush abatement laws. They fall under the county fire departments to enforce. My understanding of them is that they really only refer to kind of property edges, property boundaries. But the firefighters have very little resources. I think Maui County, they might be different now, but at one point they had 2 inspectors, right? And so these are guys, they're not just doing fuels, they're like doing home inspections, building inspections, right, for those compliances. And so there's very little in the way of policy or legislation, for example, that would sort of force a landowner to take action. So it's all really voluntary, dependent on kind of voluntary. And so why was that not done? It's because we've got really not a lot of options to force folks to use these best practices. I can't really talk about the alarm, like why did the sirens go off? I don't know. And even if they did, like, who would they have helped? Like, I also don't know, like, our options for evacuation. I think this really comes back down to the preparedness of the community, and like, what were your options to get out of the way of this thing? And even the water, I mean, when you're talking where the fuel becomes buildings, burning house to house to house, again, this is more from talking with mainland firefighters. At that point, you're talking evacuation, and the power's down, like it pumps all these. There's like a lot of things that are probably going on in those situations. It's really hard to say. Sorry, I was jumping ahead with that question.
No, that's okay. Do you know about any legislation that's being made to make all fireworks illegal in Hawaii?
No, I don't, but good luck. I don't really know. That's a tough one. I think, again, the best thing we can do is try to get people to be smarter about it. Yeah, Hawaii wildfire folks, I'm not going to throw them under the bus, but we've been struggling with, like, how do you message for this? Like, how do you, like, be smart about it, or smarter about it? But then you see those videos on New Year's and it's like, yeah, I don't really know how you tackle that one.
Yeah. I wanted to touch a little bit on Hawaii Senate Bill SB 2355 that got brought up. And for people who aren't familiar, the bill, I'm going to read this from the Q&A because I am not familiar with it and someone else is, so I'll read it out loud. The bill noted that in 2019, West Maui suffered from an active fire season in which wildfires scorched 25,000 acres of land. It would have required DLNR to cooperate with the counties and reservoir owners to develop protocols and agreements for the use of reservoir waters for fire safety purposes. Specifically, the measure said the protocols and agreements shall address the emergency use of reservoir waters for prevention, control, and extinguishment of fires while taking into account the various competing uses of reservoir waters. The bill died without a hearing. Of possible interest, the Senate chairman of the Senate Committee on Government Operations is the senator who represents the West Maui area. He would have had the authority and choice to ask Senator Inoue for the agreement to schedule the bill for a hearing, as his committee, Government Operations, was the lead committee in the referral. From Senator Inoue's response below, I don't sense that occurred. Do you have more information? No, it's kind of a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, one thing to keep in mind during this incident is that reservoirs only help when you can use helicopters. And so for both the fires during 2018 and this recent fire, that wasn't an option because of the wind. So again, it kind of points to other measures for preparedness. And so a lot of these things, like even from the sirens to this, is like the support for like emergency response. And I think the point that we need to like digest here is the fact that the actions that would have allowed the firefighters to be successful in this context needed to have happened like months, if not years in advance, right? This is planning networks of fuel breaks, revegetating, you know, doing effective fuels management on that landscape. And so, because what happens when you can't fly helicopters? The reservoir doesn't do anything for you.
Right.
Just, you know, I think it's an important thing where you're not going to always have all the tools available to you. So that's not, there's no silver bullet. Maybe that's another way to say it.
Right. What are some fire resistant vegetation that can be planted to mitigate fire? Or do you know of potential reforestation or revegetation plans that are already maybe in the works or being discussed?
Yeah, so one of the benefits that we have here is, well, I can talk kind of about two sides of this. Like on the one side, you can work with the grasses, and that's through grazing. And one of the big factors from what I was able to see on the ground around Lahaina was that you had lots of shrubs out there, which would have been like casting all these embers out. And so one of the things that you can do with grazing is you can reduce the woody component there. That reduces the ember cast off these fires, and then reduce the fuel loads, which can actually, you know, help reduce the intensity and increase the chances of putting the fire out. Again, when you have 80-mile-an-hour winds, that's going to be jumping brakes and things like this. So it's again, just one of the tools in the toolbox. On the flip side of that, one of the benefits we have with these grasses, most of them are these, they don't do well with shade. Right? So you can plant other shrubs that will shade them out, trees. I mean, we can go native or non-native, but you can pretty much imagine anything else in that landscape. Even if you do like patchwork plantings, they've done experimental work with this showing that even having other kinds of vegetation to disrupt the continuity of those grasslands will slow the spread of a fire. And this is just something having to do with the nature of grass fires. Like the more continuous that front is that's approaching, you know, building steam essentially, the faster it moves. And so any way to kind of disrupt the continuity of that fuels, but then, you know, the approach where like DOFA is trying, for example, are these linear features. And some of the evidence just in the aftermath of the Mānoa Road fire supports that as well, where you see these windbreaks and things that were on the landscape where the fire pretty much laid down as it approached them and kind of burnt around them. But yeah, there's a lot in the Q&A I'm trying to track too.
Yeah, there's a lot and everyone has great questions. So thank you for your patience as we shift through them. Can you comment on how using native plants in the watersheds can recharge the aquifers?
Well, hydrology is not my area of expertise, although I work with some of them. But typically the idea of trees versus grass, what the kind of calculus is there is that when grasses form, you kind of get these shallow rooted, shallow mats of roots. And what that does is it reduces the ability of water to kind of travel down deeper into the soil, but it also creates more potential for runoff. So you get like that sheeting effect where water's going across the surface as opposed to down into the soil. Whereas like if you have a big tree canopy, you can imagine it's capturing all this rain and that's like trickling down the branches. And then when you get higher elevation and you start getting into our cloud forests, you have this moss component, which just acts like this big sponge. And so guys like Jim Juvic, for example, have done really cool studies showing how much fog contributes in our higher elevation forests to rainwater capture.
Great. Do you think adding funding for the watershed partnerships that you mentioned, do you think adding funding for those watershed partnerships from the government would help this issue, or is it better to have it be more community-based?
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's probably got to be a combination of both. Again, I think the underlying problem is land access. Like, do we have access to these lands that are posing the most risk, right? And so that's a thing to really like look at the configuration of ownership and tenure around there. I don't want to speak for them, but I would say on average, the fire component is pretty overwhelming for a lot of the watershed partnerships, because really their mission was to protect this remnant forest at the top that's really critical for groundwater recharge. And so while they are doing things like post-fire response, and there is, I would say they need more money. Like you think about this, if you're on a grant project to project, and this happened last year, there was a fire that burned way up above Lahaina into the forest. And now Mauna Watershed Partnership is sitting there like, well, we want to do something, but all our money is spoken to these other projects. We can't just shift gears and respond to that and help that land recover, because we don't have funding. I have to write a grant. By the time that money comes in, we're into the next funding cycle. So yeah, I mean, yes, the easy answer is yes. The extent to which that they are able to do that part and maybe work on lands down lower really would be, what kind of capacity are we talking about, right? I mean, they have really good skills, growing plants, putting plants in the ground, and really restoring ecological function of these landscapes. But it's just, they've been on shoestrings, so it's hard to say like where should they put their efforts. But they're worried. I will say that they're very worried, and they've also made a lot of progress working with communities. Waianae Mountain Watershed Partnership, for example, they've got nurseries at like almost all the public schools in Mililani and Nanakuli, and they're growing, the students are growing plants out, and they do so much volunteer work, right? So it's together. Like there's not that or this, I would say.
Right. Yeah, great point. We are just past 6:30, so I want to be aware of time. And there are still a lot of questions in the chat. So what I wanted to do is just ask one more question and take a brief break just to give a couple more announcements from Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, and then we can come back to questions. And while I'm reading through some of our announcements, Clay, if you wanted to try and answer any by typing, that would be great. But let's answer one more, because there's a couple questions regarding using R1 reuse water to irrigate native plant greenbelt fire breaks, and if that could make a difference in reducing fire threat and damage.
Yeah, I mean, that's a huge, if we have water, we are laughing. Like if you can get water to these places, you can do anything, right? And so I know it's come up on Honolulu, like they have all this reclaimed water and it's pretty much just getting, dumped out to sea, but there's so much you could do. And anyone with a green thumb here that's like knows plants, if you're sitting there waiting for their 500 millimeters of rainfall or whatever you're getting in West Maui to grow a forest back, you can accelerate all of that and then do green. Like you can have nice green, like bright green grass even is not going to burn like the parched landscape that we see just if you walk out there right now and take a look. So water is a huge component to this. It's the component, right? This is what we're talking about. This is what all of the talk about this disaster and how you recover from this, it's centering on water for a reason, right? It's the answer to like revitalizing these landscapes.
Right. Yes, the war for water continues. So Clay, I'll let you type any answers that you can get to. Sure. I'll do just a couple announcements from MNMRC and come back and answer any more questions, and we'll end here at 6:50, if that sounds okay. So another 15 minutes or so. Again, this presentation is being recorded, so if you need to hop off, you can always view it later. So thank you all to those who were in attendance tonight, and thank you, Clay, for all of the information you've been able to share with us. Again, This monthly speaker series is sponsored by the County of Maui, usually held on the first Wednesday of every month. Our next Know Your Ocean Speaker Series event will be held on Wednesday, October 4th with Tiara Stark, presenting on her study about sources of marine debris on Maui. To sign up for this talk and future talks, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter, Reef and Brief, at mauireefs.org. As I mentioned earlier, you can support ocean water quality on Maui by volunteering or donating to our community-based coastal water quality monitoring program, Hui o ka Waiʻola. This program is conducted by Maui Nui Marine Resource Council, the Nature Conservancy, and West Maui Ridge to Reefs Initiative in partnership with the State of Hawaii Department of Health Clean Water Branch. Our program leads and volunteers test ocean water quality every 3 weeks at 29 locations in South and West Maui. Help us support the expansion of new sites in West Maui by donating at huiokawaiʻola.com. Your contributions make a huge difference. Again, some of these initial recovery and response efforts that I mentioned earlier are unfunded. You can support Mauka to Makai restoration projects from ungulate fencing and population management, reef-friendly landscaping, coral restoration, as well as limu sampling for nitrogen isotopes and pesticide testing. A small amount goes a long way for Maui Nui's reefs, and now we have even more work cut out for us in response to the recent fires in Lahaina and Kula. You can donate now at mauireefs.org. Again, if you've missed some or all of tonight's presentation, you'll be able to view it on Facebook Live on our Maui Nui Marine Resource Council Facebook page and our YouTube channel, Maui Reefs. You can follow us on social media as well for updates and news. And last but not least, we wanted to give a thank you to our sponsors and supporters who are making our work possible. And we also wish to thank individual donors and viewers like you. Mahalo for making a difference. So now we can hop back over to our Q&A. And I'll see how much progress we're making here. We still have quite a few open ones. Okay. Oh, this one is interesting. Do you think there is room to use a mixture of fire retardant non-natives along with native plants as a way to create a plant fire break, or would just bulldozing fire breaks be better practice?
Yeah, I think the reforestation is probably a better, replanting even with non-natives is totally an option. We've seen pretty cool sort of mixes of species being used on some of the fire breaks here. Makaha Valley comes to mind, but there are disadvantages to dozing, and that primarily being erosion, right? So typically fire breaks, which is where you kind of get down to mineral soil, aren't all like the best practice that we recommend because of the erosion impacts. But for sure, non-native plants, like anything that casts shade, like mango trees, kukui even would be good. I would say that tends to be sometimes reluctance because a lot of the folks working on these projects are with watershed partnerships, so they're native species bias. But I am not. I think anything we should be trying lots of different stuff. One of the species that comes to mind is a kind of a random forestry planting tree called Calitris intertropica. I actually worked on this species in Australia, and it kind of casts a really heavy layer of needles that is very difficult to set on fire, and heavy shade, slow growing, but very drought tolerant. So there's a lot of cool species that we could be playing around with.
Great. Yes. Can landowners of unmanaged lands be held liable if their negligent land management practices result in property loss in adjacent areas?
Yeah, I do not know. I don't know. I mean, I think we don't typically, I can say this, typically when we've seen lawsuits, so again, we're in like a new era really for Hawaii, like we don't usually lose homes in that. So typically though, on the mainland, from what I've seen, and this is again in like the news, is that they go after the ignition source. Right, so that's typically what the lawsuits center on. But.
Right. Another participant is wondering if anyone has explored using seawater to fight fires, especially in waterfront communities.
Yeah, this is a question that comes up, but they do dip out of the ocean. The fire department, the helicopters will dip out. Typically, the questions always come up is, does it hurt the forest if they're dumping salt water? And my answer is always like, probably not as much as the fire, but I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where it's very particular probably to Hawaii, but they will dip out of the ocean. Usually, it all depends on proximity. So they're like trying to find water the closest that they can to the fire to reduce basically increase how many buckets they can do.
Okay, we know that there was a really large freshwater pond and wetlands down in Lahaina. What do you think, or maybe would this be a good model to kind of restore that, as well as the canals that would help in any way?
I think that would clearly make it safer from fire. And again, this is really where it needs to be in the hands of the community, right? To make these decisions. This is like what everyone's calling for is to have a seat at the table so that they can, map out what they want to see for their community. And like, for sure, if you have water features and this is happening like on Oahu, where they're restoring lo'i to protect farms, right? So yes, easy one for sure would work. How difficult it would be to do, I don't know. Like, that's the thing. I'm not an engineer here, so.
Right. Okay. From your experience as well, and maybe interacting with community groups and land management, how many citizens or community members are aware of things like this person is mentioning being under a red flag warning for all leeward areas through Thursday afternoon? How many citizens are aware and would support aggressive ignition control?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. We have been like shouting in the void, I feel like, for a long time. Again, because the impacts are typically on the forest and on the reef, and it's not really enough to get people to really act. Ignitions are really hard, right? Because you're talking about changing human behavior and you don't really have direct control over that. And the strategy is awareness, right? Education and awareness. But you can also do other things, like you can contain ignition. So like your fire break and fire fuels mitigation strategy, you can either do it around things that you are worried about protecting, like your home or like the forest, for example, but you can also do it like along roadsides so that accidental ignitions aren't as common and frequent, right? So when where people have like heavy traffic, it's like the other strategies, like contain places where the ignition risk is highest, do fuels control around there, but direct, I don't know, like, what do? You need to hopefully educate people. And then that's really coming into the schools and yeah, I don't think anybody really knows like how you can do that effectively, or if that's like, because you just don't have direct control over people's behavior. Not to say that we shouldn't. If 75% are accidental, potentially those are preventable, right? Which would make a big difference.
Right. Yeah. And as you were mentioning, it's been a long time and a complete recipe to bring us to this point. And essentially, we shouldn't be surprised that this is happening because of the way that lands have been managed or unmanaged in the past. And now we're on our heels a bit. And so thinking about what the best ways to move forward and mobilize and communicate can be really challenging, because it seems like it's such a huge problem. Where do you even begin? There's so many different aspects plugging into the issue that like you're saying, there's no one answer.
Yeah, but there's like two directions there. It's kind of like you need bigger like social investment, right? Like in the sense of like where we use taxpayer dollars to support jobs that would be able to do this type of land care. And then the flip side of that is like, how do you create access for and incentives? I mean, you talk about subsidies, how do you get people to be able to farm and do alternative forms of land use in these areas? And again, it comes back down to access to water and land. And that's really where the struggle has always been, and it remains. And this fire is like a symptom of that, of like, we're not doing what we could be, right?
Right. Someone asked what the best grazing animal is.
Well, I think people that know livestock love cows because they eat so much and they trample, right? So that's kind of a benefit too from them. And then the folks that we are kind of just getting into it, like sheep, because they're easy to deal with. They don't test all the fences as much as goats. And actually, I learned this recently too. They're less susceptible to disease than goats. But they're just easier to manage. But you need a lot more of them, right, to cover the same space.
Mm-hmm. My hometown used sheep and goats, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. When you look, California has these programs. In Portugal and Spain, they've got like thousands of kilometers of fire breaks that are managed by the shepherds, and the forestry departments there. The government pays the grazers to graze the fire breaks. And so this is, again, it's kind of like, because you can't make money off of agriculture, we have to think about ways that we can kind of retool that. And if it's like a subsidy like that, or if it's, support, and I'm probably going to get in trouble with some people who like think that's crazy, or, there's too much, we don't like, how are you going to pay for it? Again, like, what are the consequences that we're dealing with right now? Like, what just happened? What did we let happen? Right. And so I don't like have a lot of patience for this idea of like, what's the worth, what's the cost of this? Like the cost of this thing that just happened in Lahaina is incalculable. Like we won't understand this for years to come. So, I have a friend in Paradise whose home luckily didn't burn, but they have no school still. They're homeschooling 5 years later, right? So this is things that we need to be like prepared for, and to be really thinking about what are the needs of this community, and do we want it? Like we don't want to have that. We're like at our max creativity and resource wise to help the people that had this happen to them, and we just can't see it happen again.
Right. We are wrapping up close to 6:50. Are there any last words that you would like to share, or any other questions that you feel you could answer from the Q&A?
Yeah, I mean, there's so much in here. I mean, I'd love to get to all of them, to be honest. Even the gnarly ones. You guys there's some gnarly ones in there. But again, I think when we have talked to politicians and like brought staffers out to kind of explain this problem, it's difficult for us because it is so complex. There's so many of these interlocking factors, but there are also all these different kind of solutions. And so I just think that, we need to kind of have all hands on deck, but really, be looking to policymakers for like, not just to say, oh, please help us, but like really to demand, like, what are the things that we can do that are going to help people in Lahaina have a say in how things rebuild, and really how, this is the opportunity now. Unfortunately, it took this, but really an opportunity to again, reorient ourselves about how we value the land and what our relationship to that land is. And this is really a time to listen and heed, and what people in Lahaina, what the community from Lahaina, what they're saying, what they're calling for, because they're saying it much more eloquently and much more directly than I've been able to, and they're right. So
wonderful.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. If people do want to get in touch with you, I think your email was on that last slide. So if you would like to go back and watch and go back to the last slide and send Clay an email, I know he's probably very busy, but also wants to get to all of your questions. So thank you again so much. And we are very grateful for you coming out here on relatively short notice and just sharing your expertise. So thank you so much again.
Yeah, no problem. I'm just going to drop my email in the chat. I mean, feel free to reach out. I can try to answer if you have questions, and then just thanks for the kind words in there. I see some of those too in the Q&A.
Thank you so much,
Chair.
everyone. Aloha.
Bye.